Hi everyone, I hope you had a good weekend. It's Monday, it's April 20th, and we are starting a new unit in grammar. Our unit is focusing on commas, semicolons, colons, and dashes. And so what I have for you today is just a review of some of the material that is in your grammar, your grammar workbook, your grammar notebook. There is a copy of it that is posted in Google Classroom under Grammar Unit 4.1. It's a new tab under the Classwork tab. And what I'm looking at are pages 16, 17, and 19. One of the things that Mrs. Ulrich and I noticed as we were reading and grading your afterwards essays is that there are still a lot of errors being made with commas and semicolons. Students who are writing in run-on sentences, students who are writing in fragments, students who are leaving clauses just hanging there or phrases just hanging there. And so we thought, well, let's review the use of commas, semicolons, colons, and dashes. And so that's Unit 4 in grammar. And I looked back through what we've studied, and we have not done Unit 4 yet. So this is perhaps a really good opportunity for us to catch this before we write our last essay of the year. So, commas. Most of you know this already. The commas are pretty straightforward. When do we use a comma? We use a comma after an opener, an introductory word, phrase, or clause. And an opener can be a single word, like, furthermore, comma, I find the wording of your proposal to be offensive. Or we've got a phrase here, broken and bruised, comma, Diaz was ready to call it a day. And then we have a dependent clause. Because is one of those awubis words. So we have the dependent clause, because she had a sore throat, comma, Jana was unable to sing her solo. We use commas to set off an interrupter, which is a non-essential phrase or clause. And we talked about non-essential phrases. A non-essential phrase or clause is a phrase or clause that is not necessary in the sentence. It interrupts the sentence. It doesn't need to be there. It doesn't add vital, important information that makes the sentence clear. It's just extra fun, fluff stuff. And so there needs to be a comma on both sides of it, okay? Like William, in fact, made the all-state hockey team. In fact is an interrupter that doesn't need to be there, so it's set off by commas. And then we have the second example is Timmy, comma, the smallest of the boys, comma, was teasing my sister. It maybe doesn't really matter that Timmy was the smallest of the boys. Another example are those relative clauses, like my brother Carl, comma, who lives in Texas, comma, called yesterday. It doesn't matter that Carl lives in Texas, right? What matters is that my brother Carl called me. So that relative non-essential clause adds extra information, but it's not vital to the clarity of that sentence. So we set them off by commas on both sides. We use a comma to set off a closer, but not all closers. A fragment that is added after an independent clause is preceded by a comma. Joe dribbled up the court. That's a complete sentence. But we have this phrase ender, right? His sparkling new Nikes squeaking with each move he made. And so because that's a phrase ender or a phrase closer, we need to have a comma connecting it to the independent clause. There sat Steve. That is a complete sentence. Blissfully unaware of the chaos he had created is a phrase closer. So we need a comma to join it. We use commas. I'm going to slide this up. We use commas in a series or a list. We'll sometimes call a series a list, right? Going to school on time, doing all my assignments, and behaving well are things I can do to ensure my success in school. We have a list. Item 1, item 2, item 3. And notice the all-important Oxford comma. Right? In MLA English, we always put a comma before the and when we're talking about a list. We use a comma plus a fanboys to make a compound sentence. I'd love to help you finish your project is a sentence. I have to be at work at 9 is a sentence. I want to join them together, so I use a comma but. I'd love to help you finish your project, comma, but I have to be to work at 9. Here's another example using or. Gary will turn in his final project, comma, or he will flunk the class. We use commas to introduce a quotation, right? And it's usually after a verb. He said, she exclaimed. And that example is here. Jerry said, comma, I want some swimming goggles. We also use commas in quotations when we're interrupting the quotation for narration, right? So Stevie is actually saying, wait, you can't leave yet. That's his whole quotation. But the writer decided to interrupt the quotation with this narrative piece, demanded Stevie. That way we know who's saying it and how Stevie is saying it. Wait, comma, inside the quotation marks, right? Demanded Stevie, comma, quotation mark. You can't leave yet, period, quotation. This is what it would look like if you were writing a short story or if it's being published in fiction. Journalism, sometimes, depending on, right? Sometimes journalism has that. Okay, so commas within dialogue. We use commas in dates after the 11th. If it's a year, well, so this one is a phrase. On September 11th, 2001. That's a phrase. On is a preposition. So it's a phrase opener, so we need a comma after the year. But usually, we only need a comma between the day and the year. And then we have commas inside of addresses. So we always use a comma between a city-state. But when we're talking about an address, think about what are the lines on an envelope, right? So I live at 13768 Fruit Ridge Avenue. This is one line on an envelope. So you need to put a comma there to separate it from city, comma, state, right? And then they have a comma after Michigan to separate the address from the rest of the sentence. Then we have some instances where we don't use commas, and I was seeing a lot of misused commas on the essays that I graded. So we do not use a comma when we have a dependent clause closer, right? So remember, how do we get a dependent clause? We're using these subordinating conjunctions, the AWUBIS words, although, as, after, while, when, whenever, until, unless, because, those kinds of words. So incorrect is this top one. The boy knocked on the door, comma, while I was eating. Because it's a dependent clause closer, we do not use a comma. So the dependent clause closer gets no comma. However, phrase closers do get commas. So that's a difference, right? So we have a phrase closer like, blissfully unaware of the chaos he created. That's all by itself, it would be a fragment, right? But it's a phrase that's connected to their set, Steve. It's describing Steve's circumstances. So we do not use a comma with a dependent clause closer. We do with a dependent clause opener, though, right? We also do not automatically use a comma just because you see a fanboys. And I saw a lot of this in the papers, right? And on the Unit 5 grammar quiz, I put a question in there. She sat at the table and complained about her job, right? I put the comma there, and almost everyone got it wrong. They said, oh, that's correct. It's not. The and is not joining two independent clauses. The and is creating, in this case, a compound predicate, right? We is the subject, or we sat down. We sat is the subject. Subject, verb. We sat. Subject, verb. Everything after the verb is a predicate, right? Subject, predicate. Sat down at the table and began to talk. You could say, we sat down at the table, we sat and began to talk, or we began to talk, right? But we decided, whoever the author of this was, decided to make it a compound predicate just because it's a little more interesting. Instead of saying, we sat down, we began to talk. They made it one sentence. We sat down at the table and began to talk. Okay, so it's a compound predicate, not two compound sentences. There's no subject here. If it said, and we began to talk, right? So if it said, we sat down at the table and we began to talk, we now have a subject. So then you would have to have a comma joining two. But we don't have a subject here, so it's a compound predicate. This was probably one of the most common errors I saw in your papers between incorrect use of commas with dependent clause closers and the incorrect use of commas with a fanboys. That's not joining two independent clauses. And then this one is a little more sophisticated. We don't use commas to set off an essential phrase or clause. Essential means vitally important. Okay? So if the information is vitally important to the clarity and understanding of the sentence, there are no commas. Okay? When we looked at interrupters and we called them non-essential phrases, we talked about how these just aren't needed for the clarity of the sentence. And those commas suggest you could lift that phrase out and throw it away. You don't need it. If the clause is essential or vitally important to the clarity and meaning of the sentence, you do not use commas. You don't want to suggest that you could throw it away. So I recognize many of the students who stood with me in the front of school. If we just had, I recognize many of the students, you'd be like, what students? What are you talking about? But this essential clause, it's a relative clause because it has the who in front of it, right? This relative clause adds vital information for what students is she talking about. Is it the students I saw on TV? Is it the students that were on the bus? Who the heck is she talking about? So the relative clause is vitally important to the clarity of the sentence. I recognize many of the students who stood with me in the front of the school. Okay, so that's our comma review. I will be posting a video for semicolons and colons next.